So how can we get the biggest bang for our buck out of the command points in Codex Space Marines? Let's take a look at which stratagems really shine. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy and tactics focused 40k channel where we're all about getting the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. We've covered a lot of things about Codex Space Marines, but we haven't actually gone through the stratagems one by one yet. Today we're going to do just that. We'll go through every stratagem, how I think I'd best use it on the tabletop, and a bit of a discussion as to which ones are the ones that really have the potential to change a whole game. We're going to focus on the core Space Marine rulebook stratagems today. I know there's lots of amazing ones in the supplement books, but if we did every stratagem that the Space Marines have, we'd be here for quite a long time, to be honest. So without further ado, let's go through them one by one. First of all, we've got the stratagems that I'm not the biggest fan of, that I think, at least in the vast majority of cases, aren't likely to get you a decent return on your investment. First up, we have cluster mines for scout bikes. Basically, this is one command point to throw D3 mortal wounds at an opponent that was in combat with your scout bikes when your scout bikes fall back. I'll admit that this could be okay situationally if you've got something very tough that's good to put mortal wounds on in combat with your scout bikes, but it's really quite niche that that's going to happen. It involves your scout bikes getting into close combat and likely not being able to shoot in the next turn, and it involves them being in combat with something that's going to be good to put mortal wounds on, when scout bikes just won't be able to damage that in close combat with their own profile. Not the biggest fan just because it's so highly situational. Next we have tactical flexibility. This is the one that allows you to combat squad a squad halfway through the battle. Say if they had 10 men, then they can break down into 2 5-man squads. There's very rarely any good reason to do this in a game. If you really wanted the combat squads, just divide them before the game and save the CP. I could sometimes see the point of it if you have a big damage dealing unit wanting to receive stratagems and buffs that then needs to go 2 different ways to secure 2 different objectives late game, but that's going to assume that they haven't taken any casualties at all, which prevents this stratagem from working. Very rarely ever going to see play in my opinion. Thirdly, we have adaptive strategy for 1 command point. This is the one that allows you to go back a doctrine, say from assault to tactical, or tactical to devastator. Now I'm not saying that there might not be times that this would be appropriate to use, but if you're playing your army sensibly, then they're just going to be incredibly rare and far between. This would have to be something like Ultramarines going into tactical doctrine to use their bonuses on a whole bunch of tactical squads or other rapid fire bolt weapons, and then having most of their bolt weapons eliminated, incentivizing them to go back a doctrine. I could see it being useful in some cases when you've got an army with lots of mixed weapons, say lots of rapid fire but lots of heavy as well, but in general for most competitive play, you're kind of incentivized to build around one of the doctrines anyway, rather than having a mix of them, so that only half can ever be in use in one doctrine. Again, not unusable, just incredibly niche when it's actually going to make sense to use. Moving on, we have stratagems that I consider have the potential to get a decent return on your investment in command points in a reasonable number of scenarios. First of all, we have Armour of Contempt. This is the one for 1 CP to shrug off mortal wounds on a 5+ feel no pain type save. Now in my opinion this is less good than it sounds. A 5+ is only 1/3 of the time after all, so you do need to be getting hit by quite a lot of mortal wounds in one phase to really be worth it. However, sometimes this is going to be the case, such as when you're getting smited by Thousand Suns or the New Grey Knights, in particular if it's a big high value target such as something like a Leviathan Dreadnought. In that case it could be 1 CP well spent. Next we have a nice uncomplicated extra damage buff. For 2 CP, Suppression Fire will allow you to fire your Thunderfire Cannon or Whirlwind all over again, which can be pretty helpful for getting some early game damage on the opponent, or maybe just making sure that that last troop on an objective is dead, preventing some victory points. It is a little pricey at 2 CP, which is the only reason I didn't put it in the high tier, but it is a solid way of getting more damage into your Marines list when it counts. Next we have 1 command point for Death to Traitors, and it's sort of giving death to the False Emperor to Space Marines when they're fighting Heretic Astartes. Basically they'll get extra attacks on 6s, which can't generate any additional attacks themselves. This usually will equate to a flat 25% damage increase for any unit that hits on a 3+, so certainly isn't bad when you are fighting those Chaos Marines. A small but decent extra damage boost could easily be worth 1 CP in the right scenario. Next up we have 1 or 2 command points for Veteran Intercessors. This is the one where you can give your Intercessors an extra attack and extra pip of leadership. For 1 command point if the squad is 5 models strong, and for 2 command points if it's more than that. This was a bit cheaper when it came to the Vigilus Defiant detachment, and now it's 2 command points for just that 1 extra attack. It isn't quite as worth it anymore. Having a bunch of intercessors running around with extra attacks is certainly powerful, particularly with the other combat buffs that you can put on them, but all of that command points are really going to add up and limit your options later in the game. I'd not personally used this one myself, but I have seen it used to reasonable effect on the table, so there are builds that you can do with it. I just don't necessarily think that they're the strongest thing that you can do with intercessors. Next up we have another intercessor option, which is Bolt Storm. This is the one to allow your auto bolt rifles to auto hit the enemy when they're within half range, i.e. 12 inches normally. Now this sounds pretty impressive, and if the squad is unbuffed then it will equate to a 50% increase in hits, or an additional 10 strength 4 hits over a full 10-man unit. Now 10 strength 4 hits isn't bad, but it isn't absolutely loads for 2 command points, and that efficiency goes down significantly when your squad starts to take casualties. It's also less efficient if you're in a captain or chapter master aura, because you're already getting quite a lot of hits anyway if you're already having your hit rolls buffed. It does lead to some extra damage, it's just your call as to whether or not that's worth the 2 command points in the scenario. Next up we have Hunter Slayer Missile, which is a nice little extra bonus which you can throw out from a repulsor or repulsor executioner that can target a vehicle or a monster and hits on a roll of 3+. If it hits, then the target suffers D3 mortal wounds, and the repulsor or repulsor executioner can't fire another one this game. Now the reason I quite like this one is because it isn't actually a shooting attack, so it doesn't actually have to be fired at the same time as the repulsor or repulsor executioner's main weapons, meaning that you could use this at the end of your shooting phase to try and get one last kill on a hard target that's only got a few wounds left, or you could try and finish off a hard target to mean that your next unit is free to fire all of its guns at something different. Definitely has options this one, as it's quite free as to when you use it, or whether you use it at all. Moving on, we have Hellfire Shells and Flak Missile, both options that replace the Heavy Bolter and Missile Launcher respectively with D3 mortal wounds. The Hellfire Shells are unrestricted, fire one shot if it hits and you suffer D3 mortal wounds. The Flak Missile must target a target with fly, they get +1 to hit, and again it's D3 mortal wounds. These both used to be pretty good when you could combine it with the Armorium Cherub in the Devastator squad to fire the weapon twice, which Games Workshop decided against in an FAQ fairly recently. Now you can't do that, they're a little bit more questionable. In particular, the Flak Missile does replace you firing an entire missile launcher at the enemy, meaning at most targets you're not actually gaining all that much damage on average on the target for your 1 command point investment. Both of these I think are best used when you need some reliable damage on a target, again just to trim off the last 1 or 2 wounds, to put a hard target down so your rest of your army can focus on something else. In general, I think that using them for just trading command points for damage output really isn't the best use of your command points. There's likely going to be things that are stronger to use for the most parts during the game compared with these. Again, like the Hunter Slayer Missile, these are just ones that I would use to target things that are on their last couple of wounds and finish them off with a fair degree of reliability. Next up, for 1 command point, we have Masterful Marksmanship. This is the stratagem that gives Sternguard veterans +1 to wound with their special issue ammunition bolt guns. Naturally, it's best used on a big squad of Sternguard veterans with all special issue bolt guns, and it is one of the main reasons to field them in that formation. It's a decent amount of damage to be kicking out, fairly uncomplicated, trading 1 command point for extra damage on any target. Next up, for 2 CP we have Rapid Fire, and this is quite a powerful buff to intercessors shooting when they're armed with their standard issue bolt rifles. Instead of being Rapid Fire 1, they become Rapid Fire 2 for the phase, meaning that a squad of 10 of them, while using bolted discipline, will be shooting 40 shots at 30-inch range. Now this one is very solid and a lot more flexible than its auto bolt rifle equivalent. Typically on a mat squad this will equate to around 13 more hits, and even more if you're in aura buffs like the Chapter Master's aura. It's also a lot more flexible with the range, so I like this one a lot more than the Bolt Storm stratagem myself. Certainly one to consider if you are using 10-man max units of intercessors. Next up we have the much maligned Orbital Strike. This one will cost you a princely 3 CP, where you pick a point on the battlefield and roll a d6. Enemy units within that amount of inches will suffer d3 mortal wounds on the roll of a 4+. Now don't get me wrong, this is a steep CP investment, very random, so you might need to spend another command point to re-roll the range of the area of effect. It's only in the mid tier because sometimes if your opponent absolutely castles everything incredibly hard, you might be able to fit an enormous amount of units under that area. If the opponent is all bunched up, it's worth keeping it in the back of your mind, as you could get a decent amount of mortal wounds on your high investment if your opponent is just a little bit too bunched up. Obviously, in general, this isn't a stratagem that I'd use every game. It's very situational, but I think does have the potential to be viable in the right circumstances. Next up, we have Hammer of Wrath. This is another mortal wound generation one, used when you charge an assault squad or jump pack armed unit into the enemy. Basically, for every model of yours that finishes within an inch of one enemy unit, roll a dice, and on a 5+, they suffer a mortal wound. Again, this is trading a command point for mortal wounds in another form. Naturally best used when you have more jump packs. A squad of 10 will net you between 3 and 4 mortal wounds, with average rolling. As with a lot of the mortal wound shenanigans here, I think that it could be best used to have a go at finishing off a hard target that you've just not been able to shift in the shooting phase. You could even potentially throw in a squad of Inceptors to glance off the last wound or two with mortal wounds. Next up we have Big Guns Never Tire. This for 1 command point is when you move a vehicle and you can ignore the penalty for moving and shooting with heavy weapons. Again, it's going to be more viable on the bigger unit that you have, particularly things like Leviathan Dreadnoughts with storm cannons for the chapters that don't have access to any sort of method for moving and shooting with no penalty otherwise. For more normal sized units, this one is a bit more of a trade-off as to whether or not it's worth it. Of course it will increase your damage output, but not necessarily by that much. Say if you had to move and shoot a Vindicator, you'd have to ask yourself, is 1/4 of that Vindicator's firepower worth 1 command point? Sometimes that might be yes, sometimes it might not be. Next we have Fury of the First, which is our Terminator buffing stratagem. This one can give you +1 to hit with Terminators, either in the shooting or the fight phase. Now Terminators can again come in very big units, 10 of them dropping down with Storm Bolters, rapid firing at 24 inches for 40 shots hitting on 2s is a very scary thought to a lot of hordes out there. It can be quite good for countermanding the low weapon skill for their Power Fists or Thunder Hammers as well. In general, I'd say it's slightly more valuable in close combat as opposed to shooting, just because those Power Fists are so deadly, and getting an extra 33% buff on their damage output is great. Either way, it's a solid buff for 1 command point, and a genuine draw to using Terminators. Next up is Wisdom of the Ancients. This is the one that gives a Dreadnought a Captain-style reroll 1s to hit aura. This equates to a 17% buff in damage output on all the units in range, and if you don't have a Captain, this could genuinely be worthwhile as part of your gun line. Naturally, the trade-off will be whether or not you want to have a Captain there instead, but Captains do cost a significant amount of points, and if you have CP to spare that you're not planning on using on other more valuable stratagems, it could be perfectly feasible to have the first couple of turns with Wisdom of the Ancients up to provide those same rerolls and invest your HQ points elsewhere. Next up we have Skyfire for 1 command point. This is the one that buffs Hunters and Stalkers when they're shooting a unit that can fly. You add +1 to the hit and wound roll, and every unmodified wound roll of 6 results in double damage. So this is essentially 3 different buffs on their intended target, and it genuinely can double the damage output against certain flyers. It's far more useful on the Stalker than the Hunter, which is the only place that I'd really consider it. And it does make it brutally efficient at gunning down flyers. Certainly in any flyer matchup, it's probably worth spending 1 command point a turn to get this extra damage output. Next we have Steady Advance. This is the one that lets you move and shoot with your rapid fire weapons while counting as remaining stationary for bolter discipline. So move and shoot twice at 24 inches with bolters, move and shoot twice at 30 inches with bolt rifles. You could even potentially combine this with rapid fire for the double shooting. This one's useful when you absolutely need to move the squad, but you want to keep up a decent amount of firepower, so for 1 command point it could be worse. Next we have 2 CP for Skilled Riders if you happen to be using Bikers. This one, if they move then they get a 4+ invul save next turn, and if they advance they get a 3+ invul save. If you are being aggressive with a big squad of Bikers, then this is a perfectly reasonable way to make them soak up a lot more enemy fire when they go down, though I don't think it's so good that you'd actually buy in bike squads specifically to use this stratagem. Next for 2 CP we have Vengeance of the Machine Spirit. This is the one that when your Land Raider, Repulsor or Storm Raven gunship goes down, you can either choose to auto-explode it or fire with one of its weapons when it's on top profile. Now if you've seen any of my Knights videos or my videos on any of those units, you'll know how much I like auto-exploding vehicles. In particular, if you can get one of these in the middle of the opponent's army before your opponent kills it and you get to auto-detonate it, then you could be handing out an incredibly big amount of mortal wounds indeed, particularly if it's a Repulsor or a Land Raider who go up with a huge D6 wounds explosion. That being said, the ability to fire a weapon on death is certainly powerful, particularly when applied to the Repulsor Executioner's Heavy Laser Destroyer, which will naturally deal out a decent amount of damage. The absolute dream would be if your opponent kills it in their own shooting phase, and then you take out one of their tanks that was yet to fire, which could be a very big swing in the game and maybe even end their shooting phase prematurely. In hindsight, I think I perhaps should have put this one in the higher tier, as it does have the potential to be absolutely devastating in the right circumstances. Finally, to bring us back down to earth just a little bit, we have Dream-Wrought Might. This is the Primaris stratagem, where when you're fighting in close combat, each unmodified roll of a 6 automatically wounds the target, so it's essentially quite similar to the Black Templars buff that they get via their Super Doctrine, except this one works on vehicles too. In general, this is going to be most powerful on anything that you're fighting in close combat that you're wounding on a 4+ or worse. It's honestly quite a minimal buff if you're wounding on 3s or better. In general, if you're wounding on a 4+, this will be typically around about a 25% boost to your melee damage output, presuming you're hitting on 3s, so certainly worth considering if you're needing to beat up a large number of models with a big unit of intercessors or something. Finally, we get on to some of the big guns of the Space Marine Codex, stratagems which have the potential to change an entire game. First of all, we have our favourite scanner pack, the Auspex scan. For 2 command points, this one allows you to shoot an enemy unit that comes on from reserve within 12 inches of one of your Space Marine infantry squads. You do shoot at -1 to hit, but still it's incredibly powerful to get a free shooting phase out of a unit. This can be absolutely dreadful when it's combined with things like big units of aggressors, big units of centurions or assault centurions, devastators, or even just things like big units of intercessors could really put a lot of hurt downrange with this. A lot of armies will want to be dropping within 12 inches of Space Marines to either shoot them with things like plasma guns or maybe charge them out of deep strike such as Genestealer Colts, and this one genuinely makes your army a lot trickier to play against. Even just knowing that your opponent has this stratagem can mess with your positioning and make you second guess whether or not to put a unit in a vulnerable place. Auspex scan is honestly as strong for the threat as it is for the actual damage that you do. Next up, for 2 command points, we have Only in Death does Duty End, which is when you choose a character that's just been killed and they can fight in close combat for one last time. There are a whole load of ways to make Space Marine captains or other fighty characters incredible murder machines in close combat, and getting a free close combat phase in death could add up to a whole ton of damage on a key target, particularly when you think that you could use this on enormous points intensive models such as Guilliman, Marnie's Calgar, or various other special characters. Knowing that you have this can mean that you can even throw smash captains into big targets they won't be able to kill, such as Imperial Knights, knowing that they'll get to fight twice, whether through Honour the Chapter, which we'll get onto, or through this stratagem if the Knight kills them in return. In terms of amount of damage per command point invested, this one is likely to be one of your better options in Codex Space Marines by a long way. Obviously situational on your character dying, but ludicrously powerful in the right circumstances. Next up we have the Chapter Master stratagem, a key part of Space Marine lists. This 2 command point upgrade allows a captain to have the Chapter Master keyword, and his 6-inch Rites of Battle aura goes to full rerolls to hit, which with the nice new wording means that even hits that became misses because of modifiers can still be rerolled. The Chapter Master option really makes your Space Marines go to the next level in terms of shooting. A whole ton of gunline and firebase based lists use this as a massive linchpin to their strategy. As we said, it's already great against modifiers, it's partially responsible for taking things like Eldar Flyers out of the meta as much, and on top of all that, it'll make your Warlord a lot more of a beast in close combat as well. A very strong stratagem indeed. Extra rerolls all game long, it's well worth a bit of CP. Next up we have Honour the Chapter for 3 command points. This is the one that now lets any Space Marine unit fight again at the end of the fight phase. Fight again options are incredibly powerful in Warhammer 40k, and this stratagem has some of the highest theoretical ways that we can get more damage out of a Space Marines list. Say if you manage to fight again with a full squad of Assault Centurions on the charge, on average that will do you over 30 damage to an Imperial Knight. That means that in the right circumstances, you could trade 3 command points for an Imperial Knight. Obviously that's like a theoretical maximum to the amount of damage that you're going to put out with this, but it serves to highlight the potential, and how this one can often massively outcompete any of the little stratagems to buff damage in other ways. It can also be great for positioning, either moving your models to tie up enemy gunline units so they can't shoot next turn, or maybe even getting them extra movement, allowing them to wrap and trap an enemy model that's going to keep them safe from shooting next time round. This one's a real cornerstone of the Space Marine stratagem arsenal. The extra damage it can do is very strong, and the extra movement that it also gives can be incredibly helpful at a key time. Next we have Duty Eternal for Dreadnoughts. This is the much feared one that halves the damage characteristic of incoming weapons on the Dreadnought, and best of all you can use it reactively, meaning that you only have to spend the command point when your Dreadnought's actually shot. We've seen this used and abused quite a lot over the last few months, particularly on things like Leviathan Dreadnoughts, which are incredibly hard to kill anyway. In terms of durability buffs, there's not a lot else in the game that's more valuable than 1 command point for half damage on the most efficient weapons that kill the target, and this one's an absolute staple in any Space Marine list that involves dreadnoughts. Next up, I've included Gravitic Amplification in the higher tier here, and is one of the few straight damage dealing strats that I think really punches through. You use this when a unit is firing grav cannons with grav amps, namely Devastators or Devastator Centurions. It basically turns these weapons into solid anti-everything guns, and what's more, you can even re-roll the damage roll too. This can be used in Grav Devastator drop pods, Devastator Centurions starting on the field, or Devastator Centurions from Raven Guard or White Scars dropping onto the board. For example, an Iron Hands Devastator drop pod with an Armorium Cherub, their unique Devastator doctrine, and the Stratagem will on average put 20 wounds on any standard armoured target. That's anything with toughness 6, 7 or 8 and a 3-up save and no invul. Without the Stratagem it would only be 10 wounds, so at least in this configuration that's 1 command points to gain you 10 wounds on armoured targets. Not too bad at all in my opinion. Next up we have Relics of the Chapter and Hero of the Chapter, which are the Marine strats to buy in additional relics or 1 additional Warlord trait. Relics and Warlord traits provide incredibly powerful in-game effects that last the entire game long, and it doesn't really need to be said why these are both very strong picks for 1 command point. Because they're deployed pre-game, you can see your opponent's army list and tailor the exact relics and warlord traits that you need for the certain matchup, which is certainly a positive. And I particularly like the change to the relic stratagem, which means that each additional relic just costs 1 command point, and I honestly think it's a change that they should probably farm out to the rest of the codexes if Marines are going to work like this. Next up, for 1 CP, we have Tremor Shells, which affects the Thunderfire Cannon. This is the one where the Thunderfire Cannon becomes -1 to wound, but the targeted unit halves the result of movement, advance and charge rolls. Used by a cunning operator, this one can be used to keep certain units out of the game for a turn, allowing you to focus on the rest of your opponent's army and then only deal with that threat next turn. It's particularly powerful against slow-moving melee units such as Plague Bearers for Demons and Orc Boys, who are not going to like having their charge distance affected. It's also great for ranged units that have short range, such as Tar-Pitting Leviathan Dreadnoughts, Space Marine Vindicator tanks, and various others. It's a very solid debuff this one, and if you're feeling particularly extravagant, you could also combine it with Suppression Fire to be able to slow 2 units in your opponent's army per turn. Next we have a 3 command point stratagem called Target Sighted, which is the one that affects the Stalker Bolt rifles on the Intercessors. Now this one I was a little bit umming and ahhing as to whether or not to put it in the high tier or the mid tier, but I settled on the high tier in the end, just because in certain matchups and certain games, the ability to shoot an enemy character off the face of the board is worth its weight in gold. You use this when a squad of Intercessors armed with Stalker Bolt rifles shoot in the shooting phase. For that turn they can target enemy characters even if they're not the closest model, and any 6s to wound gets mortal wounds as well. It's best used on a big squad of 10 of these to absolutely shoot the living daylights out of a surprised enemy warlord, particularly a key buffing character which is essential to your opponent's plans. Now it's a powerful ability, but don't get me wrong, it's very pricey. 3 CP can achieve a lot, and you probably will be wanting to pile every single Stalker Bolt shot into that character, because if you spend the 3 CP and then don't kill the character, then you've just thrown a lot of command points down the drain. Bear in mind the opportunity cost of what those extra command points could buy you elsewhere, and what those extra Stalker Bolt shots could achieve this turn just firing at targets they can shoot normally. But in the right circumstances, there is absolutely room to use this one. Taking out skulking characters is certainly powerful. Finally, we're back with a new favourite of the Space Marine Codex, Transhuman Physiology for 2 CP. This is the one that doesn't allow anything to wound any Space Marines infantry or biker units on any better than a 4+, so when you get some of your elite Marines targeted by very heavy firepower, popping this one could certainly make them a lot more likely to live. If you have some of your elite toughness 5 infantry, such as Centurions or Aggressors, being wounded on 3s, going down to 4s isn't quite so spectacular. It'll basically be a 33% increase in their survivability. It's more powerful on toughness 4 Marines taking strength 8 hits, which almost cuts the damage output in half. One particularly notable example is Imperial Knight Stomp attacks. They come in at strength 8 and AP -2, so if you can reduce the number of wounds incoming, you have a pretty decent chance of getting a lot of safe Marines that otherwise would have died. Now I think people do use this one a little bit too easily. It's very tempting to pop Transhuman at the first opportunity. I've played quite a few games where my opponents used it quite early in the phase on a unit that I wasn't actually particularly bothered about focusing down that turn. so I've just been able to shoot other things and them get no benefit at all really from the transhuman. So I would use it sparingly, certainly not every single time your marines get targeted by heavy weapons. You really have to think about whether or not the durability buff is actually going to be worth it this turn, compared with the opportunity cost of what you could do with those command points later. All that being said, if it does let an incredibly important marine unit survive for one more turn of damage dealing, it is powerful enough to potentially change a game. So there you have it, a very extensive look at all the marine stratagems in the book, and high time that we'd covered these on the channel. Let me know if you've had any good success with any of these recently, or if you disagree with any of the placements on this list, and why I might have undervalued or overvalued a strat. If you'd like to see more videos from Auspex Tactics, feel free to subscribe. We have new 40k content coming every single day. And if you're enjoying these tactics videos and want to support the channel has a Patreon page down in the description below, and it helps me focus on these videos as opposed to working at my regular job, so any contributions are certainly appreciated. There's a few other benefits there as well, including early videos, the occasional prize draw, and my own tournament lists and reports, so if any of that interests you, please check it out. Thanks very much for listening, I'll hope to see you guys next time.